There are things you carry in your chest that feel too heavy to breathe around, too sharp to swallow, too dangerous to ever let out. This is one of those things. I've rehearsed this confession 1,000 times in my head, standing in front of bathroom mirrors at 3 in the morning, whispering to my reflection like it might absolve me of what I've done. But mirrors don't forgive. They just show you exactly who you are, and sometimes that's the cruelest truth of all. I need to tell you about Marcus. Not because I want to. Not because it'll make me feel better. But because keeping it inside is killing me slowly, like poison in my bloodstream, and I think I'm finally ready to die from the truth instead of living with the lie. It started the way these things always start, I suppose. Innocently. Accidentally. With a single moment that felt like nothing at the time but later became everything. I was 26, married to David for 3 years, living in one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions outside Phoenix where every house looks exactly the same and everyone pretends their lives are perfect. David worked construction, came home every night covered in dust and exhaustion, and I taught 2nd grade at Sunnydale Elementary. We had the kind of marriage that looked good on paper but felt hollow in practice, like we were both playing roles we'd never quite learned how to inhabit. David's older brother Marcus had just gotten out of the military after 15 years of service. Army Special Forces, the kind of man who could disappear into a crowd or command a room with equal ease. He'd been stationed overseas for most of David's and my relationship, just a voice on speakerphone during family calls, a face in photographs that got passed around at holidays. But then his deployment ended, and he came home to Arizona to figure out what civilian life was supposed to look like. He stayed with us for 2 weeks while he looked for an apartment. 2 weeks that stretched and contracted like time does when you're holding your breath underwater, not sure if you're drowning or learning to breathe in a completely different way. The first night he was there, I made dinner. Nothing special. Just spaghetti and garlic bread, but I remember standing at the stove stirring the sauce and feeling his eyes on me from across the kitchen. Not David's casual, distracted glances, but something more focused. More deliberate. When I turned around, he was sitting at the breakfast bar, chin resting on his folded hands, watching me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "You cook like my grandmother used to," he said, and his voice was different than I'd expected from those phone calls. Deeper. More careful with words. She'd stand at the stove for hours, never measuring anything, just knowing. I laughed. Probably too loudly. I'm definitely measuring. I'm terrible at the whole intuitive cooking thing. He smiled, and something in my chest shifted. Not romantic, not yet. Just recognition. Like seeing a familiar face in a crowded room, except I'd never seen this face before, never had a real conversation with this man who was supposed to be family but felt like a stranger carrying secrets I wanted to understand. David came home. 20 minutes later, beer in hand, talking about his foreman and some problem with a foundation that wouldn't set right. Marcus and I were still talking about cooking, about his grandmother's kitchen in a tiny town in Montana where he'd spent summers as a kid, about the way certain smells could transport you back to being 7 years old and believing the world was safe. "God, you two are deep," David said, not meanly, just tiredly. He kissed my forehead, grabbed a plate, and turned on the television. The conversation shifted to surface things, work, weather, the Diamondbacks' losing streak. But I kept catching Marcus's eyes across the table, and every time I did, I felt like we were continuing some other conversation underneath the one everyone else could hear. That night, after David fell asleep, I found Marcus on the back patio, smoking a cigarette and staring up at the stars. I'd never seen him smoke before, but everything about him seemed like a collection of things I'd never seen before, habits and gestures and expressions that belonged to a person I was just beginning to discover. "Can't sleep?" I asked, sliding the glass door closed behind me. He took a long drag and shook his head. "Too quiet." Spent so many years falling asleep to helicopters and gunfire that silence feels unnatural. I sat down in the chair next to him, tucking my legs up under me. Is it hard? Being back? Everything's hard, he said, and his honesty surprised me. David never talked about difficult things, never admitted when he was struggling. I keep waiting for someone to tell me what to do next, where to go, what the mission is. But there's no mission. There's just this. He gestured vaguely at the suburban landscape stretching out in front of us, identical houses with identical lawns and identical cars parked in identical driveways. It looked like peace, but I heard what he was really saying. It looked like a kind of prison. What do you want to do? I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Then he turned to look at me, really look at me, and said, I want to figure out how to be a person again instead of just a soldier. We talked until almost 2 in the morning. About his deployments, about the friends he'd lost, about the way violence changes you even when you're fighting for good reasons. About my job, about the kids in my class who came to school hungry or bruised or so desperate for attention they'd act out just to be seen. About David, about the way marriage could feel like the safest and loneliest thing in the world at the same time. It was the kind of conversation that should have happened between him and David, between brothers. But David didn't ask deep questions. Didn't sit with uncomfortable silences, didn't know how to hold space for someone else's pain without trying to fix it or dismiss it or change the subject. I did, though. I'd always been good at listening, at making room for other people's truths. It was probably what made me a decent teacher, what made kids feel safe enough to tell me about their home lives, their fears, their dreams. But with Marcus, it felt different. Like I wasn't just listening to be helpful, but because I genuinely wanted to understand who he was underneath all the armor he'd built around himself. The next morning, David left for work early, and Marcus and I ended up having coffee together on the patio. He'd made it, strong and black, the way he'd learned to drink it in the desert. I added cream and sugar, and he watched me do it with this small smile that made me feel self-conscious and seen at the same time. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone more typical, I guess. David always dated girls who were pretty and sweet and didn't think too hard about things. I should have been offended, but I wasn't. Maybe because I thought the same thing about myself sometimes, wondered if I'd chosen David precisely because he was safe and predictable and wouldn't challenge me to be more than I was. And now? I asked. He looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup, and I felt something electric pass between us. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. Like he was seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there. Now I think my brother's an idiot if he doesn't realize what he has. It was inappropriate. It was crossing a line. It was the kind of thing that should have made me stand up and walk away, should have made me remind him that I was married to his brother, that this conversation was heading somewhere it shouldn't go. Instead, I felt my face flush with something that might have been pleasure, might have been fear, might have been the first stirring of something I didn't want to name. Marcus, I said, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He sat down his coffee cup and looked away. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. It's okay, I said, even though it wasn't, even though I could feel something shifting between us that couldn't be shifted back. I'll find an apartment this week, he said. I need to get out of here before I do something stupid. But he didn't find an apartment that week. Or the next. There was always something wrong with the places he looked at, always some reason to stay a little longer. David didn't mind. He liked having his brother around, liked feeling like he was helping with the transition back to civilian life. And I stopped looking for reasons to leave the house in the evenings, stopped making plans with friends, stopped doing anything that would take me away from those conversations on the patio, Those moments when Marcus would let his guard down and show me pieces of himself that felt like gifts. We developed routines. Morning coffee before David woke up. Late night talks after David went to sleep. Grocery shopping together on Saturdays when David worked overtime. Movies on weeknights when David fell asleep on the couch. We never planned these moments, never acknowledged them as anything more than convenience, but they became the scaffolding around which I built my days. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. The way Marcus's hands moved when he talked. Graceful and precise like a pianist's. The scar on his left temple that he'd gotten from shrapnel in Afghanistan. The way he listened to music with his eyes closed, like he was trying to memorize every note. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't looking, with an expression I couldn't quite read, but that made my skin feel warm and electric. 3 weeks into his stay, David went fishing with his buddies for the weekend. It was something he did twice a year, a tradition that predated our marriage, and I'd always been grateful for the solitude. But this time, the house felt different with just Marcus and me in it. Smaller and larger at the same time, like the walls had moved closer together while the possibilities had expanded infinitely. Saturday morning, I made pancakes. Not because Marcus asked, but because I wanted to do something nice for him, something that acknowledged the way he'd been taking care of small things around the house, fixing the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. Replacing the burned-out bulb in the hallway that David had been promising to change for months. He came downstairs in jeans and a gray t-shirt, hair still messy from sleep, and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen like he was surprised to find me there. "You didn't have to do this," he said, but he was smiling. "I wanted to," I said, and realized as I said it that I meant it in a way that was bigger than breakfast, bigger than pancakes, bigger than being a good hostess. We ate at the kitchen table instead of the breakfast bar, sitting across from each other like we were on a date, like we were two people who'd chosen to be together instead of two people who'd ended up in the same place by accident. "What do you want to do today?" I asked. He considered this seriously, like it was a question with weight instead of just casual conversation. "I want to see the desert. The real desert, not just the suburbs with cactus landscaping. I know a place," I said. "About an hour north. My dad used to take me hiking there when I was a kid." So we drove north, windows down, music playing softly, and I found myself stealing glances at him as he drove. His profile was sharp and thoughtful, and he had this way of drumming his fingers on the steering wheel that made me wonder what it would feel like to have those fingers touch me. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome, and I tried to push it away, but it lingered like smoke in still air. The hiking trail was mostly empty, just a few other groups scattered across the desert landscape. We walked in comfortable silence, pointing out interesting rock formations and desert wildlife, talking sporadically about inconsequential things. But underneath the casual conversation, I could feel something building between us, some kind of tension that had nothing to do with the heat or the elevation gain. Halfway through the hike, we stopped at a viewpoint that looked out over miles of untouched desert, red rocks and saguaro cacti stretching to the horizon. Marcus stood at the edge of the cliff, hands in his pockets, and I watched him watching the landscape. "This is what I missed," he said quietly. "Space. Silence. The feeling that the world is bigger than whatever small thing you're worried about." I moved to stand beside him, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and woody that made me want to lean closer. "What were you worried about?" I asked. He glanced at me, then back at the desert. "You, mostly." My heart started beating faster. "What about me?" "About wanting something I can't have. About staying in your house and pretending I'm not falling for my brother's wife." The words hung between us like a challenge. I could have denied it, could have stepped back, could have insisted that we were just friends, that he was imagining things, that this was inappropriate and needed to stop. Instead, I found myself stepping closer. "Marcus," I said, but again. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He turned to face me fully, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between what he wanted and what he knew was right. "Tell me to stop," he said. "Tell me to leave, to find an apartment, to stay away from you." I opened my mouth to say exactly that, to be the responsible one, to protect my marriage and his relationship with David and all the things that mattered more than whatever this was between us. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw something I'd never seen in David's eyes. I saw someone who saw me, not just as a wife or a teacher or a good girl who did the right things, but as a person with depths and complexities and desires that I'd spent years pretending I didn't have. "I can't," I whispered. He reached out and touched my face, just his fingertips against my cheek, and I closed my eyes and leaned into the touch like I'd been waiting my whole life for exactly this moment. "We can't do this," he said, but his thumb was tracing my jawline, and his voice was rough with want. "I know," I said, and then I kissed him. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate and hungry and full of all the things we'd been not saying for weeks. His hands tangled in my hair, and I pressed myself against him like I was trying to disappear into him, like I could somehow make us one person so I wouldn't have to carry the weight of this choice alone. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I could see my own shock reflected in his eyes. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and we both knew it. "We should go back," I said, but I didn't move away from him. "Yes," he agreed, but his hands were still on my waist, and he was looking at me like he was trying to memorize my face. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the drive up. Heavy with implications, with the knowledge that everything had changed in the space of a single kiss. When we got back to the house, Marcus went upstairs to his room, and I sat on the couch and tried to figure out how to be a person who had just kissed her brother-in-law, who had just betrayed her husband, who had just discovered that she was capable of wanting something more than the safe, predictable life she'd built. David came home Sunday night, sunburned and happy, full of stories about the fish he'd caught and the ones that got away. He kissed me hello, and I tried to kiss him back normally, tried to pretend that my mouth hadn't learned the taste of someone else, that my hands hadn't memorized the feeling of different skin, different hair, different heartbeat. But I could feel Marcus watching from the kitchen doorway, could feel the weight of our secret settling into the space between all three of us. That night, after David fell asleep, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and wondering what kind of person I was becoming. I'd always prided myself on being good, on doing the right thing, on being the kind of woman who kept her promises and honored her commitments. But lying there in the dark, all I could think about was the way Marcus had looked at me on that cliff. The way he'd touched my face like I was something precious, the way he'd kissed me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. I told myself that Marcus would find an apartment, that we'd go back to being in-laws who barely knew each other, that David would never have to know about the few seconds when his wife had discovered she was capable of wanting someone else. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Because I was already planning how to be alone with Marcus again, already imagining the next time he'd touch me, already addicted to the feeling of being seen and wanted and chosen by someone who could have anyone. The next morning, Marcus found an apartment. He showed me the listing on his phone over coffee, a one-bedroom place downtown, clean and modern and exactly what someone starting over would need. "I'm going to look at it today," he said, but he didn't sound excited about it. "Good," I said, because that's what I was supposed to say, because I was a married woman who should have been relieved that the temptation was removing itself from her house. But when he came home that afternoon and announced that he'd signed the lease, that he'd be moving out at the end of the week, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart, exactly, but something near it. Something that had been holding me together in a way I hadn't realized until it was gone. "That's great," I said, and even managed to smile. "You must be excited to have your own space again."
"Yeah,"
he said, but he was looking at me like he was trying to figure out what I was really thinking. It'll be good to get out of your hair. You haven't been in our hair, I said quickly, because that was true, because having him there had been the best part of every day, and I couldn't let him think otherwise. David came home with beer and Chinese takeout to celebrate Marcus's new apartment, and we all sat around the kitchen table making plans for moving day, talking about furniture and neighborhood restaurants and all the normal things people talk about when someone is starting a new chapter of their life. But underneath the normal conversation, Marcus and I were having a different conversation entirely. One made of glances and careful words and the space between what we were saying and what we meant. One that acknowledged that we'd found something together that we weren't allowed to keep, that we were both pretending to be happy about losing. His last night in the house, David went to bed early. He had a big job starting the next morning. Something about a foundation that needed to be poured before the weather turned, and he needed to be on site by 5 a.m. Marcus and I found ourselves alone in the living room, him packing the last of his things, me pretending to read a book, but really just watching him move around the space he'd occupied for almost a month. I'm going to miss this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the house, at everything that included me without saying so directly. Miss what? I asked, because I needed to hear him say it, needed to know that the past month had meant something to him too. He stopped packing and looked at me. You know what? Marcus, I said, and this time I did know how to finish the sentence, but I was afraid to say it. I know, he said. I know we can't. I know this is impossible. I know David is my brother and you're his wife and I'm supposed to be grateful for the hospitality and keep my hands to myself and pretend I don't think about you every second of every day. Do you? I asked. Think about me? He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I think about you when I wake up and when I go to sleep and every moment in between. I think about that kiss and what it would be like to kiss you again. I think about how you take your coffee and the way you laugh when you're really amused instead of just being polite. I think about how you listen like you actually care about the answers to your questions, and how you make me feel like I'm more than just a fucked up veteran who doesn't know how to be a civilian. I set down my book and stood up, crossing the room to where he was standing beside his packed duffel bag. I think about you too, I said, and the admission felt like jumping off a cliff. I think about you constantly, and I feel guilty about it, and I hate myself for it, but I can't stop. He reached out and cupped my face in his hands, the same gesture he'd made on the hiking trail, but this time in my living room, in the house I shared with his brother, surrounded by all the evidence of the life I'd built with someone else. What are we going to do? He asked. I don't know, I said, and then I kissed him again. This time, it was different. Slower, deeper, more deliberate. Like we were both trying to memorize it, to store it up against the drought of not having each other that was about to begin. His hands moved to my waist, and I pressed myself against him and tried to ignore the voice in my head that was screaming about what we were doing, about how wrong it was, about how much we had to lose. When we broke apart, I was crying, and I hadn't even realized it. Hey, he said softly, wiping my tears with his thumbs. Hey, don't cry. I don't know how to do this, I whispered. I don't know how to want you and stay married to David. I don't know how to be okay with you leaving, and I don't know how to be okay with you staying. I don't know how to be the kind of person who kisses her brother-in-law and lies to her husband and pretends everything is normal. You're not that kind of person, he said. You're the kind of person who feels things deeply and cares about people and tries to do the right thing even when it's hard. You're the kind of person who makes everyone around you feel like they matter. But I'm also the kind of person who's standing in her living room kissing someone who isn't her husband, I said. Yeah, he said. You're that too. People can be more than one thing. We stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the middle of my living room, and I tried to figure out how to let go of him, how to say goodbye to this thing that had barely begun but already felt essential to my existence. I should go upstairs, I said finally. David will wonder where I am.
Yeah,
Marcus said, but he didn't let go of me. This has to stop, I said. You're leaving tomorrow, and this has to stop. I know, he said, and then he kissed me one more time, soft and sweet and full of everything we weren't going to be able to say to each other. I went upstairs and got into bed next to David, who was already asleep, and I lay there in the dark trying to figure out how to be a wife again. How to pretend that I hadn't just discovered a part of myself that I'd never known existed. Marcus moved out the next day. David helped him load his truck, and I made sandwiches for lunch, and we all acted like it was a normal day, like we were just family members helping each other through life transitions. But when Marcus hugged me goodbye, he whispered, "This isn't over," in my ear, and I felt something inside me that had been holding itself together finally, completely break. For 2 weeks, I tried to go back to normal. I made dinner every night and asked David about his day and graded papers and planned lessons and did all the things that wives and teachers do. But everything felt flat, like I was watching my life from the outside, like I was an actress playing a role in a play I'd never auditioned for. Marcus texted me 3 days after he moved out. Just a photo of his new living room, mostly empty except for a couch and a television, with the caption, "Home Sweet Home." I stared at the photo for 20 minutes, trying to figure out what he was really saying, what he wanted me to say back. I texted back, "Looks good. Hope you're settling in well." He texted back, "Miss my morning coffee partner." I stared at those words for another 20 minutes, then deleted the text thread without responding. But I couldn't stop thinking about those morning coffees, about the way he'd looked at me across the kitchen table, about the way we talked about everything and nothing while David slept upstairs. That night, David noticed I was quiet at dinner. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You seem distracted." "Just tired," I said, which was true, even though it wasn't the whole truth. "Work's been stressful. Maybe you should take a personal day," he said. "Relax a little." "Maybe," I said, but I knew that relaxing wasn't going to solve the problem. The problem was that I'd discovered I was capable of wanting something more than the life I'd built, and now I had to figure out how to live with that knowledge. A week later, Marcus texted me again. This time, it was a photo of a sunrise from his apartment balcony, with the caption, "Thought you'd appreciate this." I did appreciate it. I appreciated it so much that I saved the photo to my phone and found myself looking at it multiple times a day, imagining what it would be like to watch that sunrise with him, to wake up next to him, to start my days with his voice instead of David's. This time, I texted back, "Beautiful. Thanks for sharing." He texted back, "Would be better with company." I stared at those words, my heart racing, and I knew I was at a crossroads. I could ignore the text, could pretend I didn't know what he was saying, could try to salvage what was left of my marriage and my sense of myself as a good person. Or I could acknowledge that I wanted to be that company, that I was already planning how to get to his apartment, already imagining what it would feel like to be with him without the weight of David's presence in the house. I put my phone away without responding, but I couldn't stop thinking about his text. That night, I lay in bed next to David and tried to figure out what kind of person I was becoming, what kind of person I'd already become. I'd always thought of myself as someone who kept her promises, who honored her commitments, who did the right thing even when it was hard. But lying there in the dark, all I could think about was Marcus's sunrise, Marcus's empty apartment, Marcus's invitation to be the company that would make it better. The next morning, David left for work early, and I called in sick to school. I told myself I was just going to drive around, just going to think, just going to figure out how to get my life back on track. But I found myself driving downtown. Found myself parked outside Marcus's apartment building, found myself walking up the stairs to his door. I stood there for 10 minutes, hand raised to knock, trying to talk myself out of what I was about to do. But then I thought about the way he'd looked at me on that hiking trail, the way he'd touched my face like I was something precious, the way he'd made me feel like I was more than just David's wife or a second-grade teacher or a good girl who did the right things. I knocked. He answered the door shirtless, hair messy, like he'd just woken up. When he saw me, his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like relief. "Hi," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "Hi," he said back, and then he stepped aside to let me in. His apartment was exactly what I'd expected from the photo he'd sent. Clean and sparse, like he was still figuring out how to make it feel like home. The only personal touches were a few military commendations on the kitchen counter and a photo of him and David as kids, gap-toothed and sunburned, arms around each other's shoulders. "I shouldn't be here," I said, but I didn't move toward the door. "No," he agreed. "You shouldn't." "I couldn't stop thinking about your text," I said. "About the sunrise, about company, about what it would be like to watch it with you." He moved closer, and I could smell that clean, woody cologne that had been driving me crazy for weeks. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying I want to be that company," I said, and the words felt like jumping off another cliff, like free-falling into something I couldn't control or predict or take back. He reached out and touched my face, that same gesture that had become so familiar, so necessary. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because once we do this, there's no going back. Once we cross this line, everything changes." "I'm sure," I said, even though I wasn't sure of anything except that I wanted him more than I'd ever wanted anything in my life. He kissed me then, and it was different from the kisses we'd shared before. This one was slower, deeper, more certain. Like we'd both stopped pretending that we were going to be strong enough to resist this, that we were going to be able to walk away from each other, that we were going to be able to go back to being just in-laws who barely knew each other. We spent the morning in his bed, learning each other's bodies, learning how to touch and be touched by someone who wasn't David, learning how to be people who were capable of betraying someone they cared about for the sake of something that felt bigger than loyalty or obligation or doing the right thing. Afterward, we lay tangled together in his sheets, and I tried to figure out how to be a person who had just cheated on her husband, who had just slept with her brother-in-law, who had just discovered that she was capable of wanting something more than the safe, predictable life she'd built. "What happens now?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, running his fingers through my hair. "I don't know how to do this either." "I should probably go," I said, but I didn't move away from him. "Probably," he agreed, but his arms tightened around me. I stayed until almost noon, and then I drove home and tried to figure out how to be David's wife again, how to pretend that I hadn't just spent the morning in another man's bed, how to act normal when everything inside me had fundamentally changed. That night, David came home from work and kissed me hello, and I tried to kiss him back normally, tried to pretend that my mouth hadn't learned the taste of someone else, that my hands hadn't memorized the feeling of different skin, different hair, different heartbeat. "How was your day?" he asked. "Feeling better?" "Much better," I said, and it was true, even though it was also the biggest lie I'd ever told. We had dinner and watched television and went to bed, and I lay there in the dark listening to David breathe and trying to figure out what kind of person I'd become, what kind of person I was still becoming. The next morning, Marcus texted me, "Thank you for yesterday. For the company." I texted back, "Thank you for the sunrise." And just like that, we had a code. A way of talking about what we were doing without saying it directly, without acknowledging the full weight of what we'd started. For the next 3 months, I lived 2 lives. I was David's wife, making dinner and doing laundry and attending his work parties and pretending to be happy with our quiet, predictable marriage. And I was Marcus's something. We never defined it, never called it what it was, but twice a week I would call in sick to school and drive downtown to his apartment. And we would spend the morning in his bed, learning each other, talking about everything and nothing, pretending that what we were doing was sustainable. He never asked me to leave David. I never asked him to wait for me to figure out what I wanted. We existed in this bubble of stolen time, stolen touches, stolen conversations, and we both pretended that it could last forever. But bubbles are fragile things, and eventually, they always burst. It happened on a Tuesday in March. David came home from work early, said he wasn't feeling well, and found me in the shower, washing off the smell of Marcus's cologne, washing off the evidence of where I'd been and what I'd been doing. "You smell different," he said when I got out of the shower. "Different how?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "I don't know. Just different." I told him it was a new shampoo, and he seemed to accept that, but I could tell he was paying attention. In a way he hadn't before. Watching me, listening to my explanations, noticing the things I'd been hoping he wouldn't notice. That night, he wanted to make love, and I tried to be present, tried to focus on him instead of thinking about Marcus, tried to remember how to be a wife to the man I'd married instead of the man I'd been betraying him with. But it felt wrong. Not just guilty, but physically wrong, like my body had forgotten how to respond to David's touch, like I'd been recalibrated for someone else's hands, someone else's mouth, someone else's way of moving through the world. Afterward, David held me against his chest and said, "I love you, you know that, right?" "I know," I said, and I meant it, even though I also knew that I loved Marcus, that I was in love with Marcus, that I'd been lying to myself about the nature of what we were doing together. "Sometimes I worry that I'm not enough for you," David said. "That you're bored with me, with this life we've built." "You're enough," I said, because he'd always been enough for the version of myself that existed before Marcus. But I wasn't that version anymore. I was someone who wanted more, who needed more, who had discovered that she was capable of feeling things she'd never felt before. The next morning, I texted Marcus, "We need to talk." He texted back, "Everything okay?" I texted back, "No, it can. You meet me for coffee?" We met at a Starbucks downtown, neutral territory, somewhere we could talk without the temptation of his apartment, his bed, the privacy that had been enabling us to avoid the difficult conversations we needed to have. "David's starting to notice," I said, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup like it could anchor me to something solid. He said I smell different. He's asking more questions about where I've been, what I've been doing. Marcus leaned back in his chair, and I could see the conflict playing out across his face. The same conflict I'd been carrying for months, the war between what we wanted and what we knew was destroying us. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, and it was the most honest thing I'd said in weeks. "I don't know how to stop this, and I don't know how to keep doing it." "Do you want to stop?" he asked, and his voice was careful, like he was afraid of the answer. I looked at him across the table, this man who had become the center of my world, who had shown me parts of myself I'd never known existed, who had made me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. "No," I said. "I don't want to stop. I want to leave David and move in with you and pretend that what we're doing isn't destroying 3 people's lives." "But," he prompted. "But I can't do that to him. David's a good man. He doesn't deserve this. He doesn't deserve to be married to someone who's been lying to him for months, who's been pretending to love him while falling in love with someone else." Marcus reached across the table and took my hand, right there in the middle of Starbucks, with other customers around us, other people living their normal, uncomplicated lives. "I'm in love with you," he said quietly. "I know I shouldn't be. I know it's wrong. I know it's complicated and impossible and potentially catastrophic. But I'm in love with you, and I can't pretend I'm not anymore." I felt tears starting to build behind my eyes, because hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that our stolen mornings hadn't, made it something we had to deal with instead of something we could keep pretending was just physical, just Temporary, just a mistake we kept making. I'm in love with you too, I said, and the words felt like a confession and a death sentence at the same time. So what do we do? He asked. I don't know, I said again. I need time to think. I need to figure out how to be honest about this, how to deal with the consequences, how to tell David without destroying him. Marcus nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that was coursing through my veins. Fear that taking time to think meant losing each other, that honesty meant the end of everything we'd built together, that trying to do the right thing would cost us the best thing that had ever happened to either of us. How much time? He asked. I don't know, I said. A few weeks, maybe. Just, let me figure out how to handle this without hurting everyone more than I already have. We agreed to take a break, to stop seeing each other while I figured out what to do about David, about my marriage, about the life I'd built and the life I wanted to build. But saying
Goodbye
to him in that Starbucks felt like tearing off a limb, like trying to breathe underwater, like everything inside me was screaming against what my brain knew was necessary. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. I tried to be a good wife to David, tried to pay attention when he talked about work, tried to respond normally when he touched me, tried to remember how to be the person I'd been before Marcus changed everything. But it was like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit, like trying to speak a language I'd forgotten how to speak. Every conversation felt forced, every touch felt wrong, every moment felt like I was betraying someone, either David by thinking about Marcus, or Marcus by pretending to be happy with David. David noticed the change, of course. He started asking more questions, paying more attention, trying to plan romantic evenings and weekend getaways, like he could solve whatever was wrong with us by trying harder. Are you having an affair? He asked one night, out of nowhere, while we were watching television. My heart stopped beating for a moment, and I felt like I was going to throw up. What? I said, trying to sound shocked instead of terrified. Are you having an affair? He repeated. You've been different for months. Distracted, distant, like you're somewhere else even when you're right here. I could have lied. I could have acted offended that he would even suggest such a thing. Could have turned it around on him, could have bought myself more time to figure out how to handle the situation. Instead, I found myself saying yes. The word hung in the air between us like a bomb that had just gone off, and I watched David's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, hurt, and finally, a kind of resignation that broke my heart. Who? He asked, and his voice was very quiet. It doesn't matter, I said, because I couldn't bear to tell him it was Marcus, couldn't bear to watch him realize that his wife and his brother had been betraying him together. It matters to me, he said. I looked at him, this man I'd married, this man who had never done anything wrong except fail to be someone else, and I realized that he deserved the truth, even if it destroyed him. Marcus, I said, and the name felt like a physical blow leaving my mouth. David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing the information, could see him putting together all the pieces he'd been missing. Could see him realizing that his wife and his brother had been lying to him, betraying him, choosing each other over him. My brother, he said finally. My fucking brother. David, I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. How long? He asked. 3 months, I said. Since right before he moved out. Jesus Christ, he said, and then he stood up and walked out of the room. I sat there on the couch, listening to him move around upstairs, listening to drawers opening and closing, listening to the sound of my marriage ending in real time. He came back downstairs with a suitcase, and I realized he was leaving, not me. David, wait, I said, standing up. We need to talk about this. Talk about what? He asked, and his voice was bitter in a way I'd never heard before. Talk about how my wife has been fucking my brother for 3 months. Talk about how the 2 people I trusted most in the world have been lying to me, betraying me, making me feel crazy for noticing that something was wrong. I'm sorry, I said, because it was true, because I was sorry, even though I also wasn't sorry, even though I was still in love with Marcus, even though I still wanted him more than I wanted to save my marriage. Are you, he asked. Are you really sorry? Or are you just sorry you got caught? I opened my mouth to say of course I was sorry, of course I regretted hurting him, of course I wished things had been different. But the words wouldn't come, because I realized that I wasn't sorry about Marcus, wasn't sorry about falling in love, wasn't sorry about discovering that I was capable of wanting something more than the life I'd built. I was sorry about hurting David, sorry about the lies, sorry about the betrayal. But I wasn't sorry about Marcus. I'm sorry I hurt you, I said finally. I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry I handled this so badly. But you're not sorry about him, David said, and it wasn't a question. No, I said, because he deserved honesty, even if it hurt. I'm not sorry about him. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer, like he'd already known what I was going to say. I'm going to stay at my buddy Mike's place for a while, he said. I need time to think, to figure out what I want to do about this. David, I said, but I didn't know what else to say, didn't know how to make this better, didn't know how to be the wife he deserved when I was in love with someone else. Does he know? He asked. Does Marcus know that you told me? No, I said. We agreed to take a break while I figured out what to do. Well, congratulations, he said, and his voice was so bitter it made my chest ache. You figured it out. He left, and I sat in our empty house and cried for the first time since this whole thing started. Not because I regretted loving Marcus, but because I regretted hurting David, because I regretted the way everything had unfolded, because I regretted that there hadn't been a way to discover who I was without destroying who David thought I was. I called Marcus that night and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining, and I could hear him processing the information, could hear him realizing that our secret was out, that everything was about to change. I should call him, he said finally. Maybe give him some time first, I said. Let him process this before you try to explain. There's no explanation, Marcus said. There's no excuse for what we did. We fell in love, and we chose each other over him, and now we have to live with the consequences. 2 days later, David called me. He sounded tired, older, like the conversation we'd had aged him years in a matter of hours. I want a divorce, he said. Okay, I said, because I'd been expecting this, because I knew it was what he deserved, because I knew I couldn't ask him to forgive me for something I wasn't sorry about. I don't want to fight about it, he said. I don't want to drag this out or make it ugly or try to punish you. I just want it to be over. Okay, I said again. I talked to Marcus, he said, and my heart started beating faster. What did he say? He said he was sorry. He said he never meant for it to happen. He said he tried to stay away from you. He did try, I said. We both tried. Not hard enough, David said, and he was right. Are you going to be okay? I asked. Eventually, he said. But I don't think I can have either of you in my life anymore. I don't think I can be around you and pretend that this didn't happen, that you didn't choose each other over me. I understood. Even though it hurt. Even though it meant that Marcus was losing his brother, that I was losing the life I'd built, that we were all losing versions of ourselves that we'd never be able to get back. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. David moved to Colorado, took a job with a construction company there, started over in a place where he didn't have to worry about running into his ex-wife or his brother or the memories of what we'd all been to each other. Marcus and I tried to make it work. We moved in together, tried to build a life together, tried to pretend that a relationship born from betrayal could become something healthy and sustainable. But it was harder than I'd expected. The guilt was always there, hovering at the edges of everything we did together. The knowledge that our happiness had come at the cost of David's, that we'd built our love on the foundation of someone else's pain. Marcus felt it too. He missed his brother, missed the easy relationship they'd had before I came between them. He'd wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, and I'd find him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, and I'd know he was thinking about David, about what we'd cost him, about whether it had been worth it. "Do you regret it?" I asked him one night, after I'd found him in the kitchen at 2 a.m, staring out the window at the desert landscape. "Which part?" he asked. "Any of it. All of it. Falling in love with me." He turned to look at me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict that lived in my chest every day. "I regret hurting him," he said. "I regret the way it happened. I regret that we couldn't find a way to be together without destroying him." "But," I prompted. "But I don't regret loving you," he said. "I can't regret the best thing that ever happened to me, even if it came at the worst possible cost." We stayed together for 2 years. 2 years of trying to build something real and lasting and healthy from the wreckage of what we'd destroyed. 2 years of amazing conversations and incredible physical connection and deep emotional intimacy, shadowed always by the knowledge that we were the people who had betrayed someone we both cared about. In the end, it wasn't enough. The guilt was too heavy, the foundation too unstable, the cost too high. We loved each other, but we couldn't live with what we'd done to love each other. Marcus moved to Seattle, said he needed to start over somewhere new, somewhere that didn't remind him of David or of me or of the choices we'd made together. He said he needed to figure out how to be a person who could love someone without destroying someone else in the process. I stayed in Phoenix, kept teaching, kept trying to figure out how to live with the knowledge that I was capable of wanting something more than the safe, predictable life I'd built, even when wanting that something more had cost me everything else. I never married again. I dated, had relationships, even fell in love a few times. But I never again let myself want something with the desperate intensity that I'd wanted Marcus, never again let myself believe that love was enough to justify the damage it could cause. I think about David sometimes, wonder if he ever found someone who could love him the way he deserved to be loved, wonder if he ever forgave us, wonder if he ever understood that we didn't choose each other because he wasn't enough, but because we were people who were capable of making terrible choices in the name of something that felt like destiny. I think about Marcus more than I should. Wonder if he ever found peace with what we did, wonder if he ever stopped missing his brother, wonder if he ever loved someone else the way he loved me, without the shadow of betrayal hanging over everything. Mostly, I think about the version of myself that existed before Marcus walked into my life, the woman who believed that being good was simple, that doing the right thing was always possible, that love was always pure and uncomplicated and without cost. I miss her sometimes, that woman who had never kissed someone she wasn't supposed to kiss, who had never lied to someone she cared about, who had never discovered that she was capable of wanting something more than the life she'd built. But I wouldn't trade her back, wouldn't undo what happened, wouldn't choose the safety of ignorance over the terrible, beautiful knowledge of what it feels like to love someone with every cell in your body, even when that love costs you everything else. Because the truth is, I'm not sorry about Marcus. I'm sorry about the way it happened, sorry about the people we hurt, sorry about the lies and the betrayal and the destruction we caused. But I'm not sorry about the love itself, about the way he made me feel, about the way he saw me and chose me and made me understand that I was capable of feeling things I'd never felt before. Love isn't always the cure, like I said before. Sometimes it's the poison that makes the silence easier than the truth. But sometimes, even when it's poison, even when it destroys everything you thought you knew about yourself, it's still the most real thing you've ever experienced. And sometimes, that has to be enough. I'm telling you this story not because I want absolution, not because I want you to understand or forgive or judge me. I'm telling you this story because it's mine, because it's the truth of who I became. And what I did and why I did it. I'm telling you this story because there are probably people listening who have felt what I felt, who have wanted what I wanted, who have faced the choice between safety and desire, between doing the right thing and doing the thing that makes them feel most alive. I'm telling you this story because I want you to know that you're not alone in your capacity for complicated feelings, for contradictory desires, for choices that don't have clean answers or easy justifications. I'm telling you this story because I spent years believing that I was a monster, that I was the only person who could want something so badly that I'd be willing to destroy everything else to have it. And I want you to know that you're not a monster, even if you've made choices that feel monstrous, even if you've wanted things you weren't supposed to want, even if you've discovered that you're capable of more complexity than you thought possible. We're all just people, trying to figure out how to live with the weight of our own hearts, trying to navigate the space between what we want and what we think we should want, trying to find meaning in the choices we make and the consequences we live with. I loved Marcus with everything I had, even when that love cost me my marriage, my sense of myself as a good person, my relationship with someone I cared about. I would probably love him again, if I had the chance, even knowing what it would cost, even knowing how it would end. And maybe that makes me selfish, maybe that makes me someone who learns nothing from her mistakes, maybe that makes me exactly the kind of person I used to judge before I understood what it felt like to be inside a story instead of watching it from the outside. But it also makes me human. Flawed and complicated and capable of both great love and great damage, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes in ways that can't be separated or solved or forgiven. That's the truth I've learned to live with, that I am capable of both tremendous love and tremendous betrayal, that I can be both the person who destroys a marriage and the person who experiences the most profound connection of her life, that I can be both the villain and the heroine of my own story, depending on which lens you use to look at it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can be, people who are trying to figure out how to love and be loved without destroying everything in the process, people who are learning that the heart is not a simple organ with simple desires, people who are discovering that the stories we tell ourselves about good and evil, right and wrong, are often more complicated than we want them to be. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask of ourselves, to be human, to be flawed, to be capable of both creation and destruction, to be worthy of love even when we've made choices that feel unworthy of love. Maybe that's enough. The silence that follows this confession will be different from the silence that came before it. It will be a silence that holds knowledge instead of secrets, truth instead of lies, acknowledgement instead of denial. And maybe, in that silence, there will be room for something that looks like peace, even if it doesn't look like forgiveness. Maybe there will be room for understanding, even if there's no room for absolution. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to be seen in our full complexity, to be understood in our contradictions, to be accepted in our flawed humanity. Maybe that's enough. It has to be enough. Because it's all I have left to give.